He lived a quiet life in a modest house on a peaceful street. To the neighbors, he seemed like any other man, polite, reserved, and always keeping to himself. Most days he would step outside in the early morning, jog around the block, nod to those he passed, and return home with a calm smile. His house was tidy, his yard well kept, and he had a sense of order in everything he did. Some neighbors admired his discipline, while others barely noticed him at all. Inside the walls of his home, however, his life was far from ordinary. While he lived a life of routine and simplicity, he carried a past that few could imagine.
He had been a Navy SEAL, one of the most highly trained soldiers in the world.
His days had once been filled with missions that tested every ounce of strength, courage, and skill he possessed. He had been trained to survive in the harshest conditions, to think quickly under extreme pressure, and to face danger without hesitation. But those days were behind him, or so it seemed. He preferred to keep his past private. There was no need to tell neighbors, co-workers, or even casual acquaintances about the life he had lived. It was a life full of discipline and sacrifice, and he had moved on to find peace in a world far less chaotic than the battlefields he had known. His focus now was simple things: keeping his home in order, enjoying a quiet evening with a book, helping neighbors when he could, and taking walks around his neighborhood. Despite his calm exterior, there were small signs that all was not completely peaceful in the neighborhood. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed a group of men who often loitered nearby. Their looks carried disdain, and their conversations, though hushed, carried an air of hostility. He paid them little mind at first, thinking they were just troublemakers or kids trying to prove themselves. But there was something in the way they looked at him, something sharp and dangerous that set off a quiet warning in his mind. His instincts, honed over years of training, told him to remain alert. He continued with his daily routines, careful not to appear concerned. Each morning, he would jog around the streets, keeping track of the people he saw along the way. He remembered faces, noted behaviors, and silently made mental maps of the neighborhood. This was habit for him, something that had become second nature during his service. It was also quietly reassuring. He knew his surroundings and understood the patterns that others missed. The neighborhood itself was a mix of old and new. Some houses were well kept, others slightly worn, but all had a sense of life and community. Children played outside in the evenings, neighbors waved as they returned from work, and dogs barked cheerfully from yards. It was the kind of neighborhood where people thought they knew each other, but in reality everyone had secrets they kept hidden. And in the midst of this ordinary life, he was living one of the most extraordinary lives quietly, almost invisibly. One evening, after returning from his usual run, he noticed something unusual. The street was quieter than usual. The sounds of children playing and dogs barking were missing. A feeling of unease settled in his chest. He slowed his pace, observing the houses around him. Everything looked normal at first glance, but his trained eyes noticed subtle changes. The faint sound of movement behind a fence, a shadow passing quickly across a window, the rustle of leaves that didn't match the wind. He walked home, keeping his movements casual but alert. Inside, he went about his evening as if nothing were wrong, preparing dinner and cleaning up afterward. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew that something was coming. He didn't rush to call the police or confront anyone. Experience had taught him patience. He understood that reacting too soon or too emotionally could create more problems than it solved. He preferred to watch, to wait, and to be ready. As the night grew darker, the neighborhood fell silent. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and a cool breeze whispered through the trees. He stood at his window, sipping a cup of tea, scanning the quiet street outside. His mind went through possibilities, considering who might be lurking, why they were there, and what they could be planning. His instincts told him that the group of men he had noticed before might be involved. He had seen enough in his life to know that people like that acted in patterns. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the silence. It came from the front of his property, followed by the sound of breaking glass. His eyes sharpened instantly. He moved quietly toward the door, not running, not panicking, but with every muscle ready for action. The noise repeated. A smashed window, something heavy being thrown, footsteps moving away quickly. The attack was deliberate, aggressive, meant to intimidate. He opened the front door just enough to see what had happened. His window had been broken, and spray paint marked hateful symbols on the walls. His mailbox had been ripped from its post. and the small garden he had carefully tended was trampled. The signs were clear. This was not random vandalism. This was targeted, meant to send a message. And yet he remained calm. Instead of rushing to anger or retaliation, he carefully surveyed the scene. He noted footprints in the soil, pieces of debris that had fallen to the ground, and any other details that could help identify those responsible. He didn't call out to the neighbors. He didn't shout or confront anyone. He simply observed, taking in everything with the precision of someone who had learned to notice details that others missed. After a few moments, he stepped back inside. He locked the door securely and checked the rest of the house. Nothing else had been disturbed and no one was inside. He took a deep breath, letting his calmness settle over him. Then he began a quiet process of planning. He knew the law would handle the situation eventually, but he also knew that relying only on chance or the police might not be enough. He needed to understand who had done this and why, and he needed to be prepared for the possibility that they would return. Over the next few days, he moved quietly, observing without being noticed. He walked the neighborhood at different times, watched for patterns, and noted any suspicious activity. He didn't carry weapons openly, and he didn't intimidate anyone. To the casual observer, he was just a man walking the streets, perhaps a little more attentive than usual. But behind his calm exterior, he was gathering information, planning carefully, and preparing to protect himself and his home. Neighbors began to notice a subtle change. He was still polite and friendly, still helping with small tasks or sharing a wave in passing, but there was a sense of quiet intensity about him now, a focused presence that made people feel both comforted and cautious. No one could have guessed that the man they saw every day had faced dangers far beyond anything in their own lives. No one could have imagined the training, skill, and discipline that lay beneath his calm demeanor. At night, he sat by his window, looking out over the street. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was broken only by distant traffic or the occasional dog barking. He reflected on what had happened and what might come next. He did not feel fear, because he knew he could handle whatever threat appeared, but he felt a weight of responsibility, to himself, to his home, and to the neighborhood. He wanted to send a message that violence and hate would not go unchallenged, but he also wanted to do it in a way that was controlled, precise, and just. As the days passed, the tension in the air grew. The group responsible for the attack had not been caught, and their presence lingered like a shadow over the street. He continued his routines, carefully noting everything he saw, preparing quietly for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. He knew that when the time came, he would have to act, but he also knew that acting recklessly could create more problems than it solved. His life had taught him the value of patience, planning, and strategy. In this quiet, careful preparation, he found a strange peace. The past that had once been full of danger and chaos had taught him how to remain calm under pressure, how to observe without being seen, and how to plan without panic. He carried these lessons with him into his daily life, blending the ordinary with the extraordinary. The neighbors still saw a quiet, polite man, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the surface. And so, his days continued, filled with subtle vigilance, quiet reflection, and a calm determination. He did not yet know exactly how the situation would unfold, but he knew one thing for certain. He would protect his home, his life, and the neighborhood. He would face the threat with the same discipline, courage, and intelligence that had guided him through the most dangerous moments of his past. In the quiet moments before sleep, he allowed himself a small thought, a reminder of who he was. To the world, he was a neighbor, a quiet man living a simple life. But he also knew that beneath that calm exterior was someone trained to face unimaginable danger, someone who could act decisively when needed, and someone who would never let hate and violence prevail. The night stretched on, and the neighborhood slept, unaware of the man watching over them. He sat quietly in his home, alert and ready, the calm before the storm settling over him. The world outside was ordinary, but inside he was anything but ordinary, and in that quiet vigilance he prepared for what was to come, knowing that the story had only just begun. The morning after the first attack, he woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely touched the rooftops, and the street outside was still quiet. Most of the neighborhood was still asleep, but he was already up, quietly making himself coffee and examining the damage from the previous night. The broken window, the spray-painted walls, the trampled garden, they all told a story. It was clear that someone wanted to intimidate him, to make him feel unsafe in his own home. But he didn't feel fear. He felt focus. He walked around his house, inspecting each broken detail with care. Every crack, every footprint, every disturbed piece of soil was a clue. To most people, it would seem like random vandalism, but to him it was deliberate and personal. He knew that those who attacked his home had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know the skills, the training, or the experience he carried. They only knew what they saw: a man living quietly on a peaceful street. After breakfast, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was a warm day, the kind where the sun shone brightly but didn't feel harsh. He walked slowly, keeping an eye on houses, streets, and anyone moving nearby. He noticed small details others might miss. A car parked longer than usual, a shadow that moved oddly, the way certain windows remained closed even when it seemed no one was home. He observed quietly without confronting anyone, knowing that patience was more powerful than impulsive action. As he walked, he thought about the group responsible. From what he had seen before, they were a gang of men fueled by anger and prejudice. Their hatred was obvious, crude, and reckless. They wanted to scare him, to make him feel vulnerable. But he knew better. He had faced dangers far greater than this. He had trained to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats quickly, and to act decisively when necessary. Today, he would start gathering information, not fighting yet. By mid-morning, he returned home and began a more careful inspection of the property. He took photos of the broken window, the spray paint, and the footprints. He made notes of what seemed unusual: the way the garden was trampled, the items they had moved, and the direction they had fled. Every detail mattered. He wasn't just documenting for himself. He was preparing for the next step, ensuring that if they returned, he would know exactly what to expect. Throughout the day, he maintained a calm exterior. Neighbors passed by, some giving concerned glances at the broken window, others offering quiet words of sympathy. He thanked them politely, reassured them that he was fine, and avoided revealing anything beyond what they could see. Inside, he was methodical. He moved from room to room, checking locks, examining windows, and even considering ways to improve security without making the house look like a fortress. He wanted to be ready, but he didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside again, this time carrying a small notebook. He began to make mental notes and sketches, mapping the street, the nearby alleyways, and the homes around him. He observed patterns: which houses had lights on, which neighbors tended to be home where cars were usually parked. To someone else, it might look like harmless curiosity, but for him it was strategy. He was learning the environment, understanding potential escape routes, and identifying areas where an intruder might hide. As the sun started to dip toward the horizon, he noticed movement near the edge of the street. A few of the men from the gang were there, casually loitering but clearly keeping an eye on his house. Their faces were tense, their voices low, but he could tell they were discussing the previous night. They didn't know he was watching, didn't realize he had already started preparing for them. He stayed still, partially hidden by a tree, and observed their behavior. Every gesture, every glance, every word added to the information he was collecting. Returning home as dusk approached, he started planning more actively. He had no intention of confronting the men immediately. He knew that rushing into a fight could backfire, especially in a neighborhood with families nearby. Instead, he focused on preparation. He rearranged cameras, checked doors and locks, and made sure that he had multiple ways to monitor the property. He even placed small, subtle markers to track movement, things that no ordinary person would notice, but that would help him see patterns if the men returned. Night fell, and the neighborhood became quiet again. He sat in his living room, drinking tea, listening to the subtle sounds outside, the wind rustling leaves, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional bark of a dog. It was peaceful, almost ordinary, but he knew the calm would not last. The men responsible for the attack were likely planning their next move, thinking he was unaware and vulnerable. But he was ready. Every moment of calm was an opportunity to prepare, to think, and to remain one step ahead. Around midnight, he heard a sound outside. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but his trained ears recognized it instantly. Someone was moving near the front yard, trying to remain quiet, but not quiet enough. He didn't panic. He moved silently to the window, watching without revealing his presence. The men had returned, probably thinking the first attack had succeeded in intimidating him. They were carrying more spray paint, maybe small tools, and their energy was reckless, almost careless. He observed them carefully. Their movements were uncoordinated, their focus split between vandalism and making sure no one saw them. He noticed patterns in how they moved, the way they approached the house and how they communicated with each other. He didn't need to act immediately. The more he watched, the more he understood about them, their personalities, their weaknesses, and the ways they could be outmaneuvered. Instead of rushing, he used subtle strategies to control the situation. He turned on lights inside the house at different points, causing shadows to shift unpredictably. He triggered small alarms in places they didn't expect, creating confusion without putting anyone in real danger. Every move was measured, deliberate, and precise. He wanted to protect his home while gathering maximum information about these intruders. The men grew frustrated. They tried to rush through their vandalism, their movements becoming sloppy and reckless. One of them tripped over a small object he had placed earlier, falling noisily to the ground. Another dropped a tool, the clanging sound echoing in the still night. Panic began to show on their faces. They were no longer confident. They were unsure. And all the while he remained calm, hidden, and fully in control of the situation. By the time they realized they had been watched and subtly manipulated, he had already noted every detail about them, their appearances, voices, tools, and escape routes. He didn't need to fight them yet. He had all the information he needed. They fled the scene, leaving behind more evidence of their recklessness and hatred. He watched them disappear into the night, satisfied that he had managed the situation safely and strategically. Once the men were gone, he moved outside carefully. He examined the property, noting the new damage but also the footprints and discarded items that could be traced. He collected everything methodically, making sure the police could follow the trail if needed. But he didn't rely solely on the authorities. He knew that preparation, observation, and patience were his best tools. He had acted decisively without giving in to anger, and he had maintained full control of the situation. By the early morning hours, the neighborhood was silent again. He returned inside, cleaned up the minor mess, and reinforced his home's security. He took a few moments to reflect, not with pride or anger, but with calm understanding. This was not the first time he had faced danger, and it would not be the last. But he knew that by staying calm, observing carefully, and preparing strategically, he could handle anything that came his way. The next few days would be critical. He would continue gathering information, noting patterns and strengthening his defenses. But he also knew that the men who attacked him were reckless, impulsive, and overconfident. That overconfidence would be their weakness, and he would use it carefully when the time came. Patience, preparation, and precision were his allies, and he intended to use them fully. In the quiet moments before dawn, he allowed himself a brief smile. The men had tried to scare him, to break his peace, and to test his limits. But they had underestimated him completely. They had no idea who they were dealing with. A man who had faced far greater dangers, who had trained for years to handle extreme threats, and who had the patience to wait for the perfect moment to act. As the first light of morning touched the rooftops, he sat by the window, sipping tea, watching the street awaken. Children played outside, neighbors greeted each other, and life moved forward as usual. But he remained alert, calm, and ready. The story was far from over. The men had made a mistake, and he would ensure that their actions had consequences. Not through rage or revenge, but through careful, deliberate, and effective action that left no room for failure. He had turned the first attack into an opportunity to observe, learn, and prepare. He had maintained control when others would have panicked. He had collected information when others would have acted impulsively. And he had reminded himself quietly and confidently that he was far from ordinary. To the world, he was a neighbor living a simple life. But beneath that ordinary exterior was someone extraordinary, ready to protect his home and his peace in ways the world could never expect. The calm before the storm had ended, but the storm itself was only beginning. And he would meet it, prepared, patient, and fully aware of the power he carried. The days after the second attack were quiet on the surface, But inside his home, a storm of thought and planning raged. He didn't speak much of what had happened to anyone. Neighbors who asked about the broken windows or the spray paint received calm assurances that he was fine. He smiled politely, offered a nod, and went about his day as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the truth was very different. Every moment of his waking hours was now focused on understanding the men who had attacked him and preparing for whatever might come next. He began systematically. Each morning he would walk the neighborhood not for exercise alone, but to observe. He memorized faces, noticed unfamiliar vehicles, and kept a careful eye on patterns in the street. If someone appeared at the same time every day, he took note. If a car lingered longer than expected, he recorded it. Every detail, no matter how small, could matter. His mind, trained to detect patterns and anticipate danger, worked quietly but efficiently. In addition to observation, he began documenting everything that had happened. He collected photographs of the vandalism, notes on the timing of the attacks, and sketches of the property showing areas of vulnerability. He also kept careful track of the men he had seen lurking near his house, noting their physical appearance, clothing, and behavior. He didn't share this information with anyone. This was personal work, done with the precision of someone who had been trained to gather intelligence in hostile territory. He understood that this group of men was reckless and dangerous, but also predictable in their behavior. People like that tend to act on impulse, often repeating the same patterns. If you watched closely and carefully, their weaknesses became obvious. He used the quiet moments of his day to think about how they might attempt another attack, where they could strike, and how he could respond without putting himself or neighbors in harm's way. During the afternoon, he often moved around the house, testing doors, windows, and locks. He quietly reinforced weak points, ensuring that entry points were secure. He checked the perimeter of his yard, noting areas that could provide cover or hiding spots. Every change he made was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, but it gave him a strong advantage. The goal was not to appear threatening, but to be ready for anything. At the same time, he began considering ways to gather information on the gang without drawing attention to himself. He had learned during his years in service that knowledge was power. The more you knew about your opponent, the more control you had. He started noting patterns of behavior, where they went during the day, how they communicated with one another, and the times they seemed most active. Small, careful observations became a form of strategy. One evening, he noticed a familiar figure walking past his house. The man glanced at the broken window and gave a small, mocking smirk. This was one of the gang members. He didn't react. He simply watched, remembering every detail, the way the man walked, the clothes he wore, and the direction he went. Moments like this were opportunities. Every piece of information he collected now could be used later, to prevent another attack or to stop them entirely. Inside his house, he also began preparing for communication. He set up a simple system to alert himself if anyone approached while he was away or asleep. Motion sensors, lights, and cameras were arranged so that every angle of his property could be monitored. He didn't want to alarm neighbors or make the house look like a fortress. Instead, each device was placed with precision, serving as both protection and intelligence-gathering tools. He spent quiet nights reviewing what he had observed. He made careful notes, cross-referencing events and behaviors. He thought about what motivated these men, what fear or anger drove them, and how they might escalate. He considered scenarios. What if they came back in a larger group? What if they tried to trap him? Each possibility was analyzed in detail. His training allowed him to consider every outcome logically, without emotion clouding his judgment. Despite the tension, he found moments of calm. He would sit in the living room with a cup of tea, watch the quiet street, and reflect on his life. He remembered missions that had been far more dangerous than anything happening now, operations that had demanded every ounce of skill and courage he possessed. Compared to those experiences, this was a test of patience and strategy rather than brute force. It was a different kind of challenge, one that required mental strength as much as physical readiness. One afternoon, he decided to take a closer look at the gang's activities beyond the street. He walked to nearby shops, cafes, and common areas where they might gather. He observed from a distance, blending in with other people, careful not to draw attention to himself. He noted interactions, overheard snippets of conversation, and even recognized minor habits. One of the men always wore a distinctive jacket. Another had a tendency to check the street several times before leaving a location. These small details, seemingly unimportant, would become valuable pieces in understanding their behavior. Back at home, he started planning hypothetical responses to their actions. He imagined how he could intercept them, how he could protect the property, and how he could ensure that no one else was harmed. He considered using non-violent methods first, strategies that would confuse and deter rather than immediately confront. But he also prepared for the possibility of more direct action if necessary. Every scenario was accounted for, every option carefully thought out. Even in quiet moments, he remained aware. Walking to the mailbox, stepping outside to get the newspaper, or even standing by the window, all of it was done with awareness. He noticed small details: a car parked unusually long, footsteps that didn't match the usual patterns, even the faint smell of smoke from a distant alley. His senses were sharp, his mind alert, and his patience steady. As the week passed, his preparation grew more precise. He had mapped escape routes in case of emergency, created signals for alerting neighbors discreetly, and reinforced areas of the house that might be vulnerable. He had also started considering how to involve law enforcement without escalating the situation prematurely. He didn't want to act hastily or draw unnecessary attention. Strategy required timing, and he intended to wait for the right moment. He also began thinking about the men themselves. They were reckless, arrogant, and overconfident. That overconfidence would be their weakness. People who underestimate others are often the most vulnerable. He reminded himself of this fact repeatedly, knowing that patience and careful observation could turn their mistakes into advantages. He needed to remain calm even if they returned with aggression. One evening, he noticed a pattern that confirmed his suspicions. The men tended to gather in the same areas on certain nights, always near a corner of the neighborhood that allowed them to watch his house without being seen. He made mental notes identifying the exact timing and locations of these gatherings. This information would later prove critical. He didn't act immediately but continued to monitor, knowing that careful timing was essential to any response. He also considered the neighborhood itself. Children played outside during the day, neighbors walked their dogs, and life went on as usual. He couldn't allow his vigilance to disrupt the normal flow of life. The goal was to protect himself and the community without causing panic. Every decision had to balance safety, strategy, and discretion. It was a delicate task, but one he approached with methodical care. In the evenings, he would sit quietly, reviewing everything he had learned. He organized notes, sketched maps, and even created hypothetical plans for confrontation. He imagined different outcomes, predicting possible reactions from the men. His mind worked like a chessboard, each piece representing a person, a path, or a potential action. By thinking several moves ahead, he ensured that when the time came, he would not be caught off guard. Throughout this period, he also reflected on restraint. He had the skill to act with force to stop threats decisively, but he knew that patience and strategy were often more effective. His goal was not revenge but protection. Every action he planned was meant to neutralize danger while keeping himself, his neighbors, and even the attackers safe from unnecessary harm. Discipline, after all, was as much about control as it was about action. Finally, as another quiet night settled over the neighborhood, he felt a sense of readiness. He had gathered intelligence, strengthened his defenses, and anticipated possible threats. He had observed the men's patterns, noted their weaknesses, and planned hypothetical responses. He knew that the situation could escalate, but he also knew that he was prepared. For the first time since the attacks, he felt a quiet confidence that came from preparation and understanding rather than raw strength. The world outside remained calm and ordinary, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in one of its homes. Children slept peacefully, neighbors chatted softly, and life moved forward as if nothing had happened. But inside the house, a man who had once faced the most dangerous missions in the world was ready. He had turned a threat into an opportunity, to observe, to learn, and to prepare. He reminded himself of a simple truth: the men who attacked his home underestimated him completely. They saw a quiet, polite man living a simple life, unaware of the experience, training, and discipline lying just beneath the surface. That underestimation would be their greatest mistake. As the night grew deeper, he sat by the window, watching the street one last time before bed. He reflected on what had happened, what he had learned, and what he would do next. He remained calm, patient, and alert. The men might return, and when they did, he would be ready. Not with anger, but with strategy, preparation, and intelligence. He had prepared, observed, and planned. Now all that remained was to wait for the right moment to act. And when that moment came, he would meet it fully aware, fully prepared, and fully in control. The nights had grown quiet again, almost deceptively calm. The streetlights glowed softly over the pavement, and the occasional bark of a dog was the only interruption in the silence. He knew this calm was fragile. The men who had attacked his house were reckless and predictable, and sooner or later they would return. He had prepared for this moment patiently, gathering information, observing patterns, and quietly reinforcing his home. Now everything he had done over the past weeks would be put to the test. It began with small signs, subtle noises near the edges of the property, the faint sound of footsteps on gravel, the soft rustle of leaves where the wind could not account for them. He remained still, listening, watching, and assessing. His senses were sharp, trained from years in situations far more dangerous than this. Every sound had meaning. Every shadow carried information. The night was alive, and he knew it. As the men approached, they believed themselves clever, confident in their previous attempts to intimidate him. They crept toward the house, thinking no one was watching, thinking he was vulnerable. But he was calm, invisible, and ready. He had observed their habits, their patterns, their weaknesses. They would make mistakes, as all reckless people do, and he would be prepared to respond. He watched them from a distance at first, noting how many had come, their positions, and the way they moved. They were not cautious. They were careless, laughing quietly, underestimating the danger. One of them tripped over a small object he had placed earlier, a subtle trap designed not to harm but to create confusion. Another dropped a tool, which made a loud clanging sound that echoed in the quiet night. Panic flickered briefly in their eyes. He did not act immediately. Instead, he observed. Every movement, every reaction, every whispered word was information. The men were growing frustrated, unsure, their confidence beginning to waver. He had created a controlled environment where even their mistakes could be predicted and used. They had returned thinking they could strike fear, but they had unknowingly walked into a carefully planned situation. Inside the house, he moved with quiet precision. Lights flickered on in different rooms, casting shadows that shifted and distorted the men's perception of the property. Small noises, created deliberately, caused them to hesitate, glance around nervously, and second-guess their actions. He was not seeking a fight. He was creating control. The street, the property, the moment, all of it was his domain. The men grew restless. One suggested leaving, while another argued they should finish what they started. Their voices carried a mix of bravado and fear. He listened carefully, noting which of them were dominant, which followed, and which were likely to panic. These details, trivial to an outsider, were crucial to understanding how to manage the confrontation safely. He continued to use subtle tactics. Motion sensors, strategically placed lights, and carefully positioned objects forced the intruders to move in ways he had predicted. Their confusion grew, their errors multiplied. One man stepped into a weakly lit area and nearly tripped over a barrier he had placed. Another walked too close to the perimeter fence, brushing against it noisily, drawing the attention of the others. The group's coordination began to unravel. From a safe vantage point inside, he monitored every movement. He could have confronted them directly at any moment, using his skills to stop them physically, but that was not necessary yet. Strategy required patience. The men were effectively controlling themselves into positions that made it easy to handle them. He had learned long ago that the best victories were those that required the least force and minimized risk. At the same time, he ensured the safety of the neighborhood. No one else was at risk, and his methods created a controlled environment where the threat could be neutralized without collateral damage. He had observed their habits, knew their likely escape routes, and had planned contingencies for each possibility. Every option was accounted for, every movement anticipated. The men's frustration reached a peak. They began to argue more loudly, their fear and uncertainty evident beneath the surface bravado. One suggested leaving, another insisted on pushing forward. Their movements became sloppy, unpredictable. Each error they made confirmed his observations, validated his preparation, and brought the situation closer to resolution. Then he began to subtly manipulate their perceptions further. A shadow moved in the corner of a room, unseen but noticed by the men. A faint sound from the garden drew their attention, causing them to split into smaller groups. He guided their actions without them realizing it, directing their mistakes and maintaining complete control over the situation. By now, they were no longer the aggressors. They were the disoriented ones responding to stimuli he had created. As he monitored them, he also observed their individual weaknesses. One of the men had a tendency to panic under sudden noise, another reacted aggressively when confronted with uncertainty, and another followed the group without thinking independently. These traits, observed over weeks of careful attention, were now fully exposed. He noted each one, understanding how they would respond if confronted more directly. Finally, the men were sufficiently isolated and disoriented. He could have engaged directly, but even then, he did not act with unnecessary force. Instead, he created opportunities for their own actions to lead to self-neutralization. A misstep here, a stumble there, a wrong turn. Each of these moments reduced their options and increased his control. The men had underestimated him completely. They were about to pay the price of their arrogance. When it was time, he revealed himself, not with a shout or violent action, but with presence and authority. He stepped into view in a controlled way, ensuring that each intruder could see that he was prepared, confident, and capable. The sudden realization hit them like a cold wave. They were dealing with someone far beyond what they had imagined. Their response was predictable. Panic surged through the group, arguments erupted, and the once coordinated effort dissolved into chaos. They attempted to flee, but he had already anticipated their movements. Each one was directed into an area where they could be contained or observed without unnecessary risk. Law enforcement could now respond effectively, aided by the detailed evidence and information he had gathered over weeks. As the confrontation came to an end, he maintained control. He ensured that the men could not escape untracked, that no neighbor was endangered, and that the situation concluded with minimal violence. His actions were precise, calm, and deliberate, exactly as they had been trained to be during his time in service. What could have been a chaotic and dangerous situation became an example of control, strategy, and discipline. Once the men were accounted for, some fleeing, others immobilized, he reviewed the property carefully. Nothing was left to chance. He documented every detail, from footprints to discarded items, ensuring that authorities would have clear evidence of the attack. He did not gloat or show anger. He acted with the calm confidence of someone who had seen far worse and understood that success lay in preparation and execution rather than emotion. Neighbors, awakened by faint noises, watched in confusion and awe. They saw the men retreating or being contained, and then him, calm, composed, and fully aware of the situation. For the first time, they began to understand that the quiet man they had known for months was not ordinary. His calm demeanor, polite greetings, and quiet life hid a skill and presence far beyond what they could have imagined. He did not seek recognition or praise. His goal had been protection, strategy, and justice, not showmanship. Still, the impact on the neighborhood was profound. People who had underestimated him now realized that danger had been neutralized without panic, harm, or chaos. They began to respect the quiet man who had acted decisively, who had used his intelligence and skill to ensure everyone's safety. After the confrontation, he returned inside, checking the house once more. Everything was in order. The property had been defended, the threat neutralized, and no innocent person had been harmed. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, to reflect on what had happened. Patience, observation, preparation, and calm had turned a dangerous night into a controlled situation. The lessons of his past, discipline, strategy, and restraint, had guided him once again. He knew the aftermath would be important. The men might face legal consequences, and the evidence he had gathered would ensure that justice was served. But he also knew that life in the neighborhood would gradually return to normal. Children would play again, neighbors would chat, and the quiet street would once more appear ordinary. And yet, he understood that the ordinary could never truly capture the extraordinary presence that had quietly safeguarded it. As dawn approached, he sat by the window, watching the first light touch the rooftops. The street was calm again and life moved forward. But he remained alert, thoughtful, and ready. The night had been dangerous, the confrontation intense, but it had ended in his favor because of preparation, strategy, and calm action. No force beyond what was necessary had been used, and yet the threat had been neutralized completely. In that moment, he reflected on the balance between power and restraint. He could have acted with aggression, but he chose precision. He could have sought revenge, but he chose strategy. The results were far more effective because they were calculated, not impulsive. The men had learned, perhaps too late, that their arrogance had led them into a situation they could not control. And he once again had proven that discipline, skill, and patience could triumph over recklessness and hate. The quiet street remained quiet, but now it was guarded in ways the neighbors could not fully understand. The man who had lived quietly among them had acted decisively and effectively, blending intelligence, preparation, and calm action into a single, controlled response. And in doing so, he had ensured that safety, order, and justice prevailed, leaving the neighborhood untouched by chaos and violence. The night after the confrontation, the neighborhood was quiet, almost peaceful in a way that felt like a promise. The attacks were over, at least for now. The men who had tried to terrorize the quiet street were gone, some already caught by authorities thanks to the detailed evidence he had gathered, while others had fled, their overconfidence having failed them completely. The calm was more than silence. It was the feeling of order restored, a sense that the world could continue without chaos spilling into ordinary lives. He sat in his living room, a cup of tea in his hands, reflecting on everything that had happened. The street outside looked the same as it always had. Houses lined up neatly, trees swaying gently in the breeze, a dog barking somewhere down the block, but nothing was the same. His mind replayed the events of the last few days. The initial attack, the careful observation, the preparation, the confrontation, and the final resolution. Each step had been deliberate, controlled, and precise. Every action had been a test of patience and strategy, and he had passed with complete focus and calm. Despite the tension, he allowed himself a quiet smile. He thought about the neighbors, the children who had slept unaware during the chaos, and the families who continued their routines, oblivious to the danger that had passed so close. They had been safe, protected without even realizing it. That knowledge brought him a deep sense of satisfaction, not pride, but a quiet contentment that comes from knowing the right thing had been done, and the right outcome had been achieved. Over the following days, life in the neighborhood began to return to its usual rhythm. Children played outside in the afternoons, neighbors walked their dogs and greeted one another warmly, and people began leaving doors open for brief moments without worry. Yet there was a subtle shift. While everything appeared normal on the surface, some neighbors had begun to notice the quiet man in their midst. They saw him checking the locks meticulously, observing the street with calm attention, and moving with a confidence that hinted at experience beyond the ordinary. There was a respect that grew quietly among them, though no one fully understood why. The authorities had been involved after the second confrontation. The evidence he had gathered, the photographs, the notes, the patterns, the discarded tools, and the detailed observations of each gang member, made their job straightforward. Several of the men were apprehended, their crimes documented, their intent and actions undeniable. The legal process would take time, but the crucial work had been done. Justice had been served not through impulsive action, but through careful preparation, intelligence, and strategic thinking. Even as the authorities handled the men legally, he continued to monitor his property. Habits die slowly, and his training had taught him that vigilance was never complete. Yet this vigilance was not born from fear. It came from awareness and experience. Every day he walked the streets, observed patterns, and checked the property quietly, making small improvements here and there to maintain security. His methods were subtle, barely noticeable, but they ensured that the neighborhood remained safe and that no similar threats could easily arise. He also began to reflect inwardly. The recent events had tested him, not only physically but mentally and emotionally. He had faced a threat to his home, a danger to his peace, and an insult to his life and identity. Yet he had responded not with anger or aggression, but with strategy, patience, and careful intelligence. This reflection brought him a profound understanding of the value of restraint. True strength, he realized, was not measured by force or speed, but by control, awareness, and the ability to act decisively without losing clarity or composure. Neighbors occasionally approached him with quiet questions. Some asked how he had managed to prevent further attacks. while others expressed amazement at his composure during a dangerous situation. He spoke softly, never exaggerating, never revealing too much, and always deflecting attention from himself. To them, he was simply a man who had handled a frightening situation calmly and responsibly. To him, he was someone who had turned preparation into protection, observation into intelligence, and patience into power. The neighborhood itself began to feel more secure. Where there had been subtle tension, now there was confidence. People walked their dogs at night without hesitation. Children played outdoors freely, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings. Yet he remained alert. While the immediate danger had passed, he understood that threats could appear unexpectedly. Preparation and awareness were not just for extraordinary situations. They were a way of life, a mindset that ensured safety and order in an unpredictable world. He also began small acts of restoration. The broken window was repaired carefully, the spray paint removed, and the garden replanted. These acts were simple, ordinary gestures, but they symbolized more than just repair. They represented resilience, the refusal to allow fear or hatred to dominate life. By restoring his home and property, he sent a quiet message. He would not be intimidated, and life would continue without fear. Internally, he continued to reflect on his past. His experiences as a Navy SEAL had taught him discipline, patience, and strategy, but they had also taught him humility. He knew that power without restraint could be dangerous, and that skill without careful thought could be wasted. The recent events reminded him that the same principles applied in ordinary life. Protecting oneself and others required careful observation, calm decision-making, and awareness of both immediate and long-term consequences. At night, he would sometimes sit by the window watching the street bathed in soft light. He noticed families moving quietly, neighbors greeting one another, and children playing freely in the fading light. The ordinary life he had once taken for granted now seemed precious. Each laugh, each simple interaction, each moment of peace was a reminder of why vigilance mattered and why calm, deliberate action had been so important. He had protected not just himself, but a sense of normalcy and safety that others might never fully appreciate. The events also brought him a quiet sense of personal growth. He had been tested, and he had succeeded not by seeking confrontation but by remaining disciplined and strategic. His mind, trained for extreme situations, had adapted to the challenges of everyday life, using observation, intelligence, and calm to turn potential disaster into resolution. He realized that courage was not always about facing bullets or explosions. It could also be about facing threats to one's life and home with calm, measured action. Over time, the men who had caused chaos faded from the neighborhood. Some faced justice, others disappeared into their own lives, and the street returned to a sense of normalcy. The quiet man who had protected the neighborhood remained a constant presence. People still saw him as polite, reserved, and calm, but there was an unspoken respect now. The ordinary neighbor had revealed an extraordinary skill set, one that ensured safety without fanfare, one that upheld justice without aggression, and one that quietly reminded everyone of the power of preparation, observation, and restraint. He continued his routines, walking the streets, observing quietly, and maintaining the security of his home. But there was a sense of calm now, a balance between vigilance and normal life. He could enjoy small pleasures again, reading a book in the afternoon sun, sharing quiet moments with neighbors, or sipping tea by the window while watching the street. Life had returned to ordinary,